My family called me greedy for 6 months. They said I was punishing them out of jealousy, that I'd rather burn the money than watch my siblings get rich. What none of them understood, what I couldn't tell them, because the lawyers said I legally couldn't, was that I wasn't refusing the $12 million. I was refusing to let them sign their lives away for it. My name isn't going to matter much in this story, so let's just say I'm Alina, I'm 34, and until 8 months ago, I thought I understood my father. Richard Ashford built a real estate and private lending empire out of a single duplex he bought at 26, with a loan he almost didn't get approved for. By the time he died, at 71, of a heart attack in his home office, he controlled a portfolio worth just north of $40 million, spread across 3 companies, 2 trusts, and more shell entities than even his accountant liked to admit. He had 3 kids. Diana, the oldest, who spent her 20s trying to look like she belonged in our father's boardrooms and her 30s actually getting invited into them. Trey, Marcus Jr., but nobody called him that after he was 6, the baby of the family, the one who always needed a little more help than the rest of us, and always got it. And me, the middle one, the one who left the family business at 24 to become a paralegal, because I wanted a life that didn't run on my father's schedule. None of us were close to him, exactly. You don't get close to a man like Richard Ashford. You get useful to him, or you get distant from him, and either way you learn to read his moods before he opens his mouth. He died on a Tuesday. We found out on a Wednesday because his assistant, not one of us, was the first person he'd listed as an emergency contact. That should have told me something right there. It didn't, not yet. The funeral was smaller than I expected for a man who'd spent 40 years accumulating people who owed him favors. Maybe 200 people, half of them business associates checking their phones during the eulogy. Diana cried. Trey looked like he hadn't slept in days, which, knowing Trey, probably meant he'd been drinking instead of grieving. I stood in the back and felt mostly numb, the way you do when a complicated relationship ends before you've finished being angry at it. 2 weeks later, the 3 of us sat in a downtown conference room with Richard's longtime estate attorney, a careful, silver-haired man named Harold Coleman, and a man I'd met maybe 4 times in my whole life, Grant Whitfield, my father's business partner and chief operating officer for almost 20 years. I want you to picture the room, glass walls, a view of the skyline our father had helped build half of, Coleman at the head of the table with a leather folder in front of him. Whitfield sitting a little too close to where Coleman would normally sit, which I noticed and didn't think much of at the time. Your father's estate, Coleman began, is valued at approximately $41 million, held across 3 primary entities: Ashford Capital Holdings, Ashford Residential Partners, and the Ashford Family Trust. Diana sat up a little straighter. Trey exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 2 weeks. Per the terms of the will, Coleman continued, the estate is to be divided equally among the 3 surviving children. Each of you is entitled to liquid and investment assets valued at approximately $12 million. I remember the silence in that room. Not celebration, silence. The kind where everyone's doing math in their head and trying not to look like they're doing math in their head. There is, however, Coleman said, one condition attached to the distribution. He slid 3 copies of a document across the table. Thick, maybe 40 pages each, dense with the kind of legal language that's designed to be skimmed, not read. The Ashford Legacy Continuance Agreement, Coleman said. Your father structured his estate so that inheritance is contingent on each beneficiary signing this agreement within 90 days of his passing. It formalizes certain continuity provisions for the family businesses going forward. Trey had his pen out before Coleman finished the sentence. Continuity provisions, Diana repeated, flipping through the pages without really reading them. Meaning what exactly? Meaning, Whitfield said, speaking for the first time and smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. Your father wanted to make sure the businesses he built stayed strong after he was gone. It's mostly formalities. Non-disparagement clauses, some governance language, confirmation of existing management structures. Standard stuff for an estate this size. Standard stuff. I want you to remember that phrase because it's going to come back around." Diana signed hers 11 minutes later, right there at the table, barely past page 6. Trey signed his 4 minutes after that. He didn't even finish reading the summary page. I watched him sign his name like a man closing his eyes before jumping off something high, like if he thought about it too long he might not do it, and he needed this to be over. $12 million each, free and clear, just needed a signature. I didn't sign. It wasn't a dramatic moment. I didn't stand up and make a speech. I just said I wanted to take my copy home and have someone look it over first, since it was 40 pages of legal language, and I'd learned exactly one thing in 10 years of paralegal work. Nobody, and I mean nobody, should sign a 40-page document at a conference table in 11 minutes, no matter whose name is at the top of it. Whitfield's smile flickered just barely when I said that. Coleman nodded like he'd expected it. "Of course," he said. "You have 90 days. Diana rolled her eyes. "Of course Alina needs a lawyer to sign a family document," she said, not quite under her breath. "Dad's barely in the ground." I let it go. I didn't have the energy to explain, in that room, that reading a contract before you sign it isn't paranoia. It's just what you do when you've spent a decade watching what happens to people who don't. I called my friend Priya that night. We'd gone through paralegal training together. She'd gone on to actually finish law school while I stayed in the trenches doing document review for a mid-size firm. If anyone was going to read this thing properly, it was her. "Send it over," she said. "I'll take a look this weekend." "It's 40 pages. Alina, I read merger agreements for breakfast. Send it." I sent it. Then I did something I'm not proud of. I put it out of my mind for a few days because some small, tired part of me wanted to believe Whitfield. Standard stuff. Formalities. It would have been so easy to believe that. $12 million easy. The family group chat, meanwhile, had become a highlight reel. Diana posted a picture of a listing for a house in the hills. Trey, predictably, was already talking about a boat. There was a lot of heart emojis, a lot of "Dad would be proud," a lot of language that made it sound like the money had already landed in their accounts, when in reality the 90-day window hadn't even closed and the funds were still sitting in probate. I didn't say much in the chat. I didn't want to be the person raining on a family that had just buried its father and needed something to feel good about. But I also noticed something. Scrolling back through it later, nobody in that chat, not once, asked what was actually in the document they'd signed. They asked what they were going to buy. Priya called me 8 days later and asked if I could meet in person. That should have been my second sign. Priya does everything over email. She hates phone calls, hates meetings, sends voice memos instead of talking live whenever she can get away with it. So when she asked to meet in person at a coffee shop with her laptop, I knew before I sat down that this wasn't going to be a sign here. It's fine conversation. "Okay," she said, sliding her laptop toward me. "I need you to read this section first. Page 19, Section 7C. I read it twice. Section 7C, stripped of the legal padding, said this. Any beneficiary who signed the agreement was transferring their voting shares in Ashford Capital Holdings and Ashford Residential Partners into a newly formed entity called the Ashford Continuity Trust, and nomming Grant Whitfield as sole trustee with full discretionary control for a minimum term of 15 years. "Wait," I said. "So Diana and Trey didn't just sign to get their inheritance. They signed away control of the businesses to Whitfield." "That's the headline, yeah," Priya said. "But it gets worse. Keep going." Section 9. Every signer had agreed to what the document called continued operational participation, meaning Diana and Trey were now contractually obligated to work within the Ashford companies, in roles determined by the trustee, for the same 15-year term, at compensation set unilaterally by that same trustee, Grant Whitfield. If they left before the 15 years were up, or refused a role, or spoke publicly against the trust's decisions, there was a specific non-disparagement clause with real teeth. They forfeited not just future distributions, but a portion of what they'd already received, clawed back through a lien against personal assets. So they didn't inherit $12 million, I said slowly. They inherited $12 million and a 15-year contract with a man who now legally controls every business they're tied to, and if they ever try to walk away, he can take assets back. Yes, Priya said. And there's one more thing. Page 31. There's a section acknowledging that signers accept joint and several liability for existing and future debts of Ashford Capital Holdings. I actually laughed, the wrong kind of laugh, the kind that comes out when something is too absurd to process as anger yet. Debts? What debts? I don't know, she said, but I pulled some public filings while I was waiting for you. Ashford Capital has 3 active liens against commercial properties and what looks like a pending dispute with a lender out of Chicago. I can't tell you the exact number, but it's not nothing. I walked home that night instead of taking the train. I needed the time. Here's what I understood, standing on that sidewalk. My father hadn't left us an inheritance with a condition attached. He'd built a trap and called it a gift. He knew he had to know that grief and grief money make people sign things fast. He knew Trey would jump at any number with a comma in it. He knew Diana had spent 15 years wanting a real seat inside the family business and would take a role without asking who was actually in charge of handing it out. And I think, though I'll never be able to prove this part, that he knew exactly what Whitfield would do with 15 years of unchecked control over 2 people who couldn't afford to walk away. The condition wasn't a formality. The condition was the entire point. I wanted to call Diana and Trey that night. I picked up my phone twice. Both times I put it back down. Not because I didn't care, because I knew with total certainty how that conversation would go. I'd tell them what was in the document. They'd tell me I was being dramatic, that a lawyer friend with a grudge against Whitfield was feeding me paranoia, that I was jealous because I hadn't signed, and now I was trying to talk them out of their own inheritance. They'd already signed. Telling them what they'd signed, before I had proof solid enough to stand up in a courtroom, would just make me the villain faster. So instead, I did the thing I actually know how to do. I built a case. Over the next 6 weeks, I didn't say a word to my family. I let them think I was still thinking it over, dragging my feet the way they already assumed I would. Priya and I pulled every public filing tied to Ashford Capital Holdings, Ashford Residential Partners, and this took some digging, 3 shell entities that had quietly moved money between them over the last 4 years. We found the Chicago lender dispute. We found that Ashford Residential Partners had been personally guaranteed against by my father using assets that were, under the terms of his own will, supposed to pass to us. We found that Grant Whitfield had formed the Ashford Continuity Trust as a legal entity 11 months before my father died. Not after, before. That detail sat with me for a long time, 11 months before, which meant this wasn't a grieving business partner trying to protect a legacy. This was planned. We brought in a forensic accountant Priya trusted, a blunt woman named Ruth who'd spent 20 years untangling exactly this kind of thing. It took her 3 weeks to lay it out in language simple enough for a jury, or, honestly, simple enough for my own siblings to understand, because that was always the real target audience. Ruth's summary, more or less. Ashford Capital Holdings was carrying debt close to $9 million, much of it tied to Ashford Residential Partners' failed developments over the past 3 years. Losses my father had covered privately, quietly, in ways that never showed up in the family group chat, the boats, the hillside listings. Grant Whitfield had known about this debt for at least 2 years. And the continuity trust structure meant that once Diana and Trey signed, that debt, a portion of it, proportionally became theirs. Not the company's on paper. Theirs personally through the joint and several liability clause. They hadn't inherited $12 million each. They'd inherited a 15-year contract, under a man who now had unilateral control over their income and their exit. Attached to a company that was already underwater, with a lien clause that could come after their own homes if they ever tried to leave. I sat with that finished report for 2 full days before I did anything with it. Not because I didn't believe it, because once I said it out loud to my family, there was no version of this where it stayed quiet, and no version where they thanked me right away. I want to be honest with you about something. Part of me, a small, tired, very human part, wondered if I should just let it play out. They'd called me greedy for 6 months. Selfish. Jealous. My aunt had stopped answering my calls. Diana had told a cousin at a family barbecue that I was still bitter that Dad trusted them with more responsibility. Trey hadn't spoken to me directly since the reading of the will, not once, 91 days and counting. But I kept thinking about my father's face in that conference room photo from the will reading, the one framed on Diana's mantle now. The two of them smiling next to a man who'd apparently decided, in his final year, that the safest way to keep his empire intact was to quietly indenture his own children to his business partner. I couldn't let it play out. Whatever they thought of me, I wasn't going to let that happen to them for real. I asked for a family meeting. Not a lawyer's office this time. I didn't want Whitfield or Coleman in the room. Just us at Diana's place on a Sunday. She almost said no. If this is about the will again, Alina, I really don't have the energy. It's not about the will, I said. It's about what you signed. Give me 40 minutes. If you still think I'm just being bitter after that, I'll never bring it up again. She agreed mostly, I think, because Trey overheard the call and got curious, and Diana didn't want to look like she was hiding from her own sister in front of him. I laid it all out, the trust formation date, the debt figures, the liability clause, the 15-year term. I didn't editorialize much. I just let Ruth's report and the actual contract language do the talking, page number by page number, because I needed them to see it wasn't my opinion. It was what they'd already signed. Diana went quiet in a way I'd never seen her go quiet. She kept flipping back to page 19, reading the same paragraph 3, 4 times, like she was hoping it would say something different on the 5th read. Trey didn't say anything for almost 10 full minutes. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Can we get out of it? Maybe, I said. It's not going to be simple, and it's not going to be free. But there might be a way, and I've already started looking into it because I wasn't going to sit on this and let you find out the hard way, 3 years in, when Whitfield decides your salary this year is $40,000 less than last year's, and there's nothing you can do about it. Diana's hands were shaking by the time she got to the debt figures. $9 million, she said. He let us sign onto $9 million of debt and called it continuity provisions. He probably didn't even see it as lying, I said. In his head, it probably was continuity, just not the kind you thought you were agreeing to. And Whitfield knew, Trey said. He wasn't asking. Whitfield's known this whole time. 11 months before Dad died, Whitfield already had the trust set up, I said. He wasn't reacting to Dad's death. He was ready for it. I watched something shift in both of them right then. The anger that had been pointed at me for 6 months, finally finding somewhere else to land, somewhere it actually belonged. What followed wasn't fast, and it wasn't clean, and if you're expecting a courtroom scene where Whitfield breaks down on the stand, I'm going to disappoint you, because that's not how most of these things actually end. What we did was slower and, honestly, more effective. Because I hadn't signed, I still had standing to challenge the structure of the trust itself, as a beneficiary of the original estate whose share had been affected by an undisclosed material liability. Priya helped me file a formal objection with the probate court, arguing the continuity trust provision constituted a breach of fiduciary duty. Given that Whitfield had known about the debt exposure before the will was executed and had failed to disclose it to beneficiaries at signing. Diana and Trey, once they understood what they'd actually agreed to, joined the objection. That mattered more than anything I could have done alone. It's a very different case when it's not just the sister who didn't sign making noise, and instead all 3 heirs standing together saying the disclosure was incomplete. It took 4 months of mediation. Whitfield's lawyers tried, early on, to argue that the terms were disclosed in the document itself, that ignorance of contract language you signed isn't the same as fraud, which is technically true, and which is exactly why the debt non-disclosure mattered so much, because the specific liability exposure had not been in the document. It had been structured through the shell entities Ruth found, kept just outside the paperwork Diana and Trey actually signed. Whitfield settled rather than let it go to a full hearing. I don't think that was mercy. I think his lawyers ran the numbers on what a public fiduciary duty case would do to every other business relationship he had, and decided quiet was cheaper than right. The settlement dissolved the continuity trust. Diana and Trey got released from the 15-year employment terms and the personal liability clause. They didn't walk away with the full $12 million each. Some of it went to covering a negotiated portion of the actual company debt, which, frankly, was already theirs to deal with either way. Debt doesn't disappear because a trust dissolves. But it was on their terms this time, not Whitfield's. And me? Since I'd never signed the original agreement, my share was renegotiated separately, outside the trust structure entirely. It ended up smaller than the $12 million, closer to $7 million, once the estate's actual debts were accounted for properly instead of quietly offloaded onto 3 people who didn't know what they were signing. But it was clean. No trustee, no 15-year term, no lien waiting in the wings if I ever wanted to change jobs. I signed my version of the paperwork in about 20 minutes, in Priya's office, no theater to it at all. Funny, looking back, that's roughly the same amount of time it took Diana and Trey to sign the original one at that conference table 8 months earlier. We had dinner together about 6 months after the mediation ended. Just the 3 of us at Trey's new, much smaller apartment. The boat idea had quietly disappeared somewhere around month 2 of understanding what $9 million of debt actually meant. Nobody apologized in some big dramatic speech. That's not really how my family works. But at one point, Diana just said, quietly, over dishes, "I called you greedy for wanting to read a contract. That's insane when I say it out loud now." "You weren't wrong to sign fast," I told her, and I meant it. "You were grieving, he knew that. That was the whole design." Trey didn't say much, but he started calling me every couple of weeks after that, just to talk, which he'd never really done before, not once in the 10 years before our father died. I think about my father a lot still. I don't know if he meant for it to go the way it did. If some part of him genuinely believed he was protecting the businesses he'd spent his whole life building, or if he simply trusted Whitfield more than he trusted his own children to run things without a leash on them. Maybe both. People are rarely just one thing, even in the biggest decisions of their lives, and my father, whatever else he was never simple. But I know this much. For 6 months, my family thought the sister who wouldn't sign was the one who didn't love them enough to trust the process. The truth was the opposite. I loved them enough to actually read the fine print before they signed their freedom away for a number with a lot of zeros on it. Some inheritances aren't about the money at all. Sometimes the real gift is just refusing, quietly, to hand someone a pen before you know exactly what they're about to lose.